So I want to start off, as everybody else has, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I was actually quite excited when the request came because I realized that overlaps with the beginning of my graduate studies, 40 years, and I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And wouldn't it be wonderful? Because then I can say it's a joint birthday in some sense. What I've chosen to speak with you about today is work that I continue to do around genome editing specifically. And some of you will know that I have a book out called Altered Inheritance. And what I want to do is I want to focus on a very specific part of that, and I've continued to think about it. And it's specific this idea of designer babies. And very often when we talk about designer babies, people focus on Louise Brown, the first test tube baby, the first IVF baby, etc. And the point I want to make is that she's not a designer baby. IVF is the platform technology, but there really wasn't very much of a design. There was just an effort, if you will, to circumvent a biological blockage, a problem in some sense. I also want to say that some of the things we've done since then also do not qualify as designer babies, although that term is constantly used. So this is a case of selection for a particular trait. It's controversial because some people think this is not appropriate. They wouldn't see this as enhancement. They would see this as something diametrically opposed to that. But the only point I want to make here is that these two are not designer babies. We then not only had the ability to select for, but also the ability to select against, and this is the case of the savior sibling, where on the one hand, they're selecting for HLA compatibility and selecting against Fanconi anemia. They too have been called designer babies. I'm here to tell you they're not. It continues. And I put this slide up not because it's the most controversial of some of the work that's been done, but because I wanted to be able to make a point about the difference between sex selection and gender selection. And I actually want to insist that there really isn't sex selection that's happening. It is actually gender selection. Most prospective parents really don't care about the genitals of their babies. What they care about is a particular social role that they imagine those children having. And so they really are choosing gender. But these two are not designer babies. The reason I'm making this claim is that this is a case in which technology is being used to select from the possible options that are given to us in nature, in some sense. I want to make the claim that the designer baby is when we're in fact creating a child that could not exist in terms of whatever that genetic makeup is, but for human intervention of a particular kind. And I'm going to make the claim that this is in fact the first designer baby. This is the baby that was born using nuclear genome transfer. Some people refer to it as mitochondrial transfer. I think that's a very strange thing because what's actually being transferred is the nucleus into a cell that is believed to have healthy mitochondria. And this is a case from 2016 involving work done between a physician who started the biological lab work in the US and makes the transfer in Mexico. And this is 2016. This is our first designer baby. Now, since then, we have many more designer babies that have been created in this particular fashion. Some of you will know that the HFEA approved this officially, and it's still one of the only countries that has done so. Australia is on the cusp of doing work in this space in a legal framework. And what I think is important to recognize here is that what you see, and I just have this up there so that people understand that this is not something that could have happened but for human intervention of a particular kind, taking the nucleus out of one cell, enucleating the other cell, and inserting the nucleus that you want. This gets referred to as three-parent babies. People object to that language, and yet, in fact, this is a case where you have genetic material from three individuals, not something that would have happened but for a particular kind of human intervention. And then most recently, we have the announcement that work has come to fruition in Newcastle, and they actually have a number of children that have been born of this technology. Now, when people ask me how many of these types of designer babies do we have, I can't actually answer the question. And part of the reason for that is that this technology has been used for purposes other than avoiding mitochondrial disease, but it has in fact been used in a number of countries, including before the war in Ukraine, to actually allow women of older age to have children. I won't talk about the science and the validity of that. It is to say that the technology has been used for that purpose, and there may be a few hundred children globally born of this technology. We don't know. The next designer baby that we have comes from the technology of genome editing. This is Jean Cuhet, for those of you who don't recognize him. And basically there, the technology that's being used is to actually start with a human embryo to remove some of the work and to, well, I shouldn't say to remove it, to genetically modify the nuclear DNA and then to transfer this and to have a child born. Again, a technology that could not result in a child, but, this is a designer baby because it could not have resulted in a child but for a particular kind of human intervention. And this is the work of Kathy Tai, who is a Canadian who some of you may know married Jean Cuhet earlier this year and has already divorced him. And at one time they had an idea of going forward with a project that would be looking at using this technology to create genome-edited babies. Specifically mentioned at times were things like to avoid Alzheimer's, to avoid cancers, etc. It's not clear what her company will or will not do. She has named it the Manhattan Project. She lacks in humility, perhaps. And then most of you will know that this is the most recent work that's been announced, and in a strict sense, it is something that I think will lead to another kind of designer baby in terms of the ability to genetically manipulate material that will not have come from an existing gamete. And I think the ways in which that gamete will be created will vary tremendously. And here again, what you're seeing is the ways in which you have to have a particular kind of human intervention to get this kind of designer baby. I think these technologies will become platform technologies in their own right. But what I'm asking you to think about is what happens when you're actually looking at modifying human reproduction, not limiting yourself to selection, but truly engaging in the project of design. And of course, then, we will have to ask questions about what we think of as positive traits and negative traits, because that's what people will be looking to do. They'll be looking to modify those traits by either eliminating, adding, or creating de novo kinds of traits. And so the question I think we need to think about is what constraints, if any, should there be on the ways in which we reproduce? And if we think there should be any, how do we imagine putting those constraints in place? How do we imagine overseeing those constraints? And I think that's not a small challenge. For the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus only on one of those technologies, which is this idea of the CRISPR babies. And the question is, do we want them? If we ask that question in the streets, we're going to get a particular kind of answer which tends to go in one direction, and one can think maybe this is just a vocal minority. I don't know, but we do in fact see civil society groups out saying, no, we don't want this, and in some cases using the language of GMOs in effect, so genetically modified organisms. These would just be of the human kind. And this is an image that was taken outside the 3rd International Summit on Human Genome Editing in London in 2023. And again, people in the streets objecting to the use of this technology as a way of creating the next generation. Now, what I want to do is just share with you that there's work that happens in the streets, and then there's work that happens amongst professional society, shall we say. And what you see here is an excerpt from the statement from the 1st International Summit on Human Genome Editing. Full disclosure, I was on the planning committee for that, therefore a co-author of the final statement. And the final statement is something that I have described as a beautiful, elegant ethical framework. It's beautiful and elegant. Why? Because it only has 2 elements, which I think is fantastic. There's so few ethics frameworks with but 2 elements, safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. And though it's lovely and elegant, it's also obscure. Who knows what it means, right? Since then, I've been doing a lot of work trying to actually unpack the meaning of those 2 statements. Then we have Jean Cuhet, who in 2018 announces that he has in fact created genome-edited children. And what I think is quite striking is that this announcement gets made on the eve of the 2nd International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And remember that in 2015, the statement is, we should not do this. until we have safety, efficacy, and broad societal consensus. We have neither of those two things 3 years later, whatever they might mean, but we do now have 2 babies born of this. And the interesting thing is to look at how different the conclusion is this time around from the organizing committee statement. And again, full disclosure, I was not on the planning committee for this particular statement. And here the emphasis is to say that while what Jean Curet has done is wrong, it could become acceptable in the future. In fact, he did it poorly, but other people could do it well, and therefore, from an ethical point of view, we should be able to go forward. And the thing that's interesting is this statement at the end: it's time to define a rigorous, responsible, translational pathway towards such trials. Again, the point being, what Jean Curet did was wrong for all kinds of reasons, but we need to actually figure out the ways in which we can do this well, ethically, in a manner that's defensible. And in that work, these are the proposed elements of a rigorous, responsible pathway forward: strict independent oversight, a compelling medical need, the absence of reasonable alternatives, a plan for long-term follow-up, and attention to societal effects. I actually think each of these is right in some sense, and each of these is problematic in another, and I'll end up returning to a couple of those in the remarks I'm going to make. What I want you to understand historically, 2015 you have a committee that says safety, efficacy, broad societal consensus. 2018 you have 2 babies born, and now we need a translational pathway forward. And what happens is some people who were authors of the 2015 document decide to come out and call for a moratorium. And what's, I think, interesting there for you to think about is several people are asked to sign on to this. Amongst them, the CRISPR pioneers, Emmanuelle Charpentier, Jennifer Doudna, and Feng Zhang. Only 2 of the 3 sign. And I think it's an interesting thing in terms of history to think, how might people have thought of this moratorium differently if all 3 had signed? Time continues, and we go on to the 3rd International Summit on Human Genome Editing, and what you see is almost a little bit of a pulling back. Here we see that heritable human genome editing remains unacceptable at this time. Public discussions and policy debates continue for resolving whether this technology should be used. So not how this technology should be used, but this is the stepping back, whether this technology should be used. And notice that we get a reiterating of some of the language, if you will, around safety and efficacy, societal discussion, if not consensus. Full disclosure, I am on the planning committee for this document. Now, I've made those 3 points. Why? Because one of the things we need to think about when we do regulation and policy, et cetera, is it really matters who's around the table, right? Because it ends up influencing not only the direction, but the choice of words, et cetera. And so it's one of the things that I think we need to think about when we look at other documents to see if we're seeing a consensus amongst multiple documents, we should actually look to see who are the authors of these documents. Because it may look like it's these disparate groups all saying the same thing, when in fact it may be all the same people saying the same thing. And so I want us to think about that. And now, most recently, what I think is fascinating is we now have a new call for a moratorium, because the 5 years from the 2019 paper have long expired. And this is not a call from a series of academics, but actually from a series of professional groups, right? And I think one of the things that's interesting here is that most of them are actively working in the space of somatic genome editing and are deeply concerned about how the work that other people might be doing around heritable human genome editing would impact their ability to continue their science. Again, authorship matters, right? It shapes the way in which we think about things. There's then a 4th International Summit, although it doesn't bear the title 4th International Summit because it's not part of the original group of 3 that set up the first 3 summits. But what I wanted to do is to draw to your attention another shift. And what you see here is really a focus on inclusive deliberation. And about what? Inclusive deliberation about some vision of the common good. Inclusive deliberation aimed at a minimum at reaching consensus about what questions might be asked. So maybe we're not going to get a consensus around what should we do with respect to the big picture question, heritable human genome editing, but maybe we could at least agree on what some of the important questions are that need to be answered in advance of taking those kinds of steps. And this is an excerpt from the statement issued by the Planning Committee for this international summit that was held earlier this year. And again, full disclosure, I'm on the Planning Committee for this particular meeting as well. And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is this point of wanting to question issues around human dignity, issues around the common good, looking at reconsidering ways of understanding innovation systems and how they do or don't influence how we think about human reproduction. But I also think the last principle is quite interesting, reimagining the limits of research and whether or not there are things like red lines. So I've asked the question, do we want CRISPR babies? I've tried to answer it by saying, what's civil society saying, people in the streets? Then also looking and thinking about it from professional organizations, et cetera. And I want to then just have one slide to say, well, what are we actually thinking when we move beyond that to actual efforts at governance? And here we're looking at guidelines, policies, laws around the world. This is work now that's a bit dated. I know it to be out of date, but at the time we were able to survey about half the countries of the world. And the thing that's important for you to take away from this slide is that there's no country who's colored green, okay? Now, in 2024, South Africa did amend its research guidelines, such as it was framed in such a way that so long as it was consistent with the law, one could in fact go forward and do heritable human genome editing in South Africa. Colleagues and I became engaged in that debate, and a couple of months ago, South Africa changed its guidelines back to saying we need to have further discussion. And so at this point, there is still no country in the world that explicitly permits this kind of research. The last section of my talk is really looking at the ethics of human genome editing, and these are excerpts from some of the points I try to make in my book, but that I wanted to emphasize here. The thing that I said earlier on, compelling medical need is supposed to be one of the criteria, the elements for moving forward in this space, and I want to make the point that there is no compelling medical need, at least not at this time, nothing that I've been persuaded about. And what happens is, why are we having this discussion at all? It's because some people argue that there's an important benefit associated with this technology. That benefit is supposed to be to prospective parents who would be able to have genetically related, healthy children. And this is seen to be extremely important for people who could not otherwise have healthy, genetically related children. The claim I want to make, and that I'm prepared to defend later, is that this is a want. It's not a need. And there are, if we look at some of the other elements of what it would take to have a reasonable translational pathway forwards, there are alternative ways of making sure that you would have that. And I think one of the things to appreciate here are what are the kinds of scenarios that people are imagining where this technology would be useful. And these are sort of the two most common examples, Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis. These are couples where if you have, in the first case, one partner who's homozygous for the disease, or with cystic fibrosis, both partners are homozygous for that disease, they could not have children who are healthy if they're using their own gametes. So, available alternative is use gametes from another person. But if you wanted to use your own gametes because what you want is a healthy, genetically related child, it is said that genome editing is the only technology that would allow these couples to have these children. That's true. But I want to say, and I think it's an important thing for me because I'm worried about things like opportunity costs, how many couples are we really talking about? Well, if you look at cystic fibrosis, you're really looking at a very, very limited number of people. This is data from work done by an IVF clinic in the United States saying that at any one time in the United States, there's one couple of reproductive age where both partners would be homozygous for cystic fibrosis. And if you look at that, the number of conceptions each year, therefore, with heritable genome editing might be applicable is 0.065 cases a year. And just to put that in perspective, that means one case every 15 years. I'm going to argue that's not a compelling medical need. It just isn't. And I could talk about some of the others, but I don't have time. I anticipated this. And so I just have a few quick slides where I want to highlight some of the other issues that I think we should be worried about when we're thinking about the ethics of heritable human genome editing. The first one has already been alluded to, and it's this notion of the reification of the gene. I want to say loudly, clearly, that what's most important about parenting is not a genetic link. And I think that when we focus on this, what we're actually doing is we're emphasizing the desires of parents or prospective parents. We're not actually focusing on the best interest of the child. And this is deeply problematic. I've already mentioned it as well. The other thing we need to worry about are opportunity costs. There is only so much time, talent, and treasure in the world. If we're spending it on this for that kind of purpose, i.e. responding to the want for a healthy, genetically related child, what are we not spending our time, talent, and money on? We need to worry about this. And the very last point I want to make is harms to women. I have spent most of my academic career looking at issues that affect women in reproduction, whether it's in the context of therapies or treatments. And one of the things I find quite fascinating here is everybody's concerned about the prospective parents in the abstract, everybody's concerned about the child to be born and the things that might go wrong, and who's worried about the women. I want to say to you that all these women are research subjects, and we don't frame them that way. We have already heard it's not so easy to get eggs from women. There are risks, both psychological and physical. There are risks to carrying these pregnancies. There are risks to children being born with considerable harms, and then those women asking for terminations, perhaps, and it not being granted. Or alternatively, these children being born and someone having to care for them. We don't spend nearly enough time thinking about the implications, not just for the children or the couples, but the individual women, some of whom may be parents and some of whom may just be providers of genetic material or offering gestational services. And so with that, I want to ask you to come back and think about what's a designer baby, and if we look specifically at CRISPR designer babies, do we want them? Understanding that many of the examples I've given you specifically for CRISPR would apply to the other designer babies as well. Thank you.
So, could I please ask Stephen and Hank to come back to the stage, and we'll have a discussion. And before I will allow the audience to come with comments and questions, I will let you ask questions or have comments to each other's talk, if you have them. So, the speakers, do you have questions or comments to each other's talks?
I have a comment that relates to Françoise's talk, though it's not really about the talk. It is those two first babies from Hejiankui. They're 7 years old. We have no idea whether they're healthy, sick. We actually don't even know whether they're alive or not, because the Chinese government, claiming to protect their privacy, has refused to release any information at all about them. They're in first grade, presumably.
Right. And I would add to that, we actually know that there's a third baby born.
Right.
So.
And do we even know whether that was boy or girl? Born in August, I think. Yeah.
I had a question.
Not open science.
Yeah. Stephen, please.
So I just wanted to ask Françoise actually about the concept of designer babies. I suppose two questions really. I mean, one of them is what drives that language choice, because I suppose the term designer might lead people to think that there's perhaps something a bit trivial or extravagant or luxurious about it. I mean, maybe that's the answer. But so that's the other one part of it. And the other part is, does the designer babies versus other baby distinction, does it completely track the distinction between sort of selection and modification, or might there be? I was thinking in the case of IVG, for example, if you had thousands of embryos, that could still be selection, but in principle, you could get a very, very fine-grained type of targeting, could that be a designer baby, or does it have to be modification and not selection?
So I think one of the things that I wanted to do when I played around with that language is I actually thought, well, you know, is it robust enough a distinction to do the work that I wanted it to do? Because you could say, I've designed this room. I have placed all the chairs very particularly because I wanted to create this effect, et cetera. And I am, in fact, a designer, and all I've done is selected and shuffled, you know, the furniture. And I think part of what I wanted to do is to be provocative and to have people understand that something different has happened with the ability to actually make modifications. And I think with respect to your example with IVG, because of the ways in which those gametes are made, I do think you actually have the design. It's earlier, okay? So downstream you might only have selection, but those gametes would not have existed in the first place but for the design component. So I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually say there's a different kind, and that's why you saw me kind of, you know, referring back to that, saying there's a different kind of human intervention that's happening. But yes, you know, I too too recognize that, rearranging the furniture can count as design in one sense, but I wanted people to say, no, something different is happening now. Now we're actually making choices that are not choosing between these traits. We might even be inventing new traits that have not been seen in the human species before. So, apparently bats can do much better seeing at night. And if we had the ability to allow humans to have that particular trait, that would be different. It's not something that could have come about but for, and that's why I kept saying but for a particular kind of human intervention. So that's what I want us to think about. I want to think about there's a different kind of creative element that's coming to the fore, and it allows us to make different choices that may be better or worse. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So now we have already eager questions from the audience. Niels-Erik, you were most quick.
Thank you very much for 3 wonderful talks. Excellent. I have 2 small questions, and one is about your map, the very red map. When I looked at some of the legal, how they deal with these things in different countries, I haven't done it around the world, there is a problem because it can be regulated. Very seldom it is explicitly regulated. It can be unregulated, and it can be sort of half-regulated. And your map of Europe, I don't think it's correct. There are some gray zones. There are some zones where probably you can edit an embryo or use artificials, if you forgive me, embryos, and that would be okay. We don't know what the laws say, and that, I think, is a very big problem here. My second question, which is, you are, all 3 of you, are talking about language and semantics, and I'm grown up in philosophy, and I know that there are some philosophers who try to become very famous on inventing new terms, words, whatever. And I don't care about that. What is important to me are the consequences of what we are doing, and that we might end up in asking the wrong questions if we spend too much time of trying to find new words for what we are doing. That was sort of warning.
Okay, so the first question was obviously directed to you, Françoise.
I want to be clear and more accurate. I showed you one image from that paper. That paper actually includes another map of the world where there is, in fact, a lot of green, and that map of the world has to do with where there's explicit permission to do this research in the lab, so to do germline modifications of the human embryo, but not to allow the transfer for reproduction. The slide that I showed was only with respect to allowing that second step, the transfer for reproduction. So in that map, there are places in Europe that are green because they do, in fact, allow for that work to happen in the lab. Because this was a different talk, I didn't show both of those and I didn't contextualize it. So that's the first thing to say about the maps. The second thing to say is that those maps were done, published in 2020, so the work was finished in 2019. They are in fact out of date, but I know, because I haven't published it yet, but I do know that there's no green that would still appear on that map. The only potential exception would have been South Africa, but before I could write anything, they changed it backwards again. The other thing that I think is really important to say about the maps is what is relevant is some of the places that are grayed out, they're places that would never have the capacity or the interest in doing this, so they're not going to waste any political energy even introducing legislation to say yay or nay. They don't have the capacity. I would take, for example, my home island of Barbados. Barbados is not going to do this research, et cetera. But the reason it's important to pay attention to these places is people are talking about the equivalent of medical tourism and going to places where there's in fact silence. So I think it becomes really important to understand silence can be interpreted as permissive even. So the maps are complicated. I just wanted to make a point there at the time was that no place at this stage has explicitly said we should proceed with this science for the purpose of reproduction. I have a comment about the second, but let me allow my colleagues to answer first.
Yes, the conceptual issue, the second one.
The language.
Yes, I agree with you that the language is less important than what lies underneath it, although what lies underneath it we express through the language. by talking about the difference between human as noun and human as adjective. Human as a human being, I wanted to avoid the fight over personhood versus humanity, a deep philosophical fight about whether you get rights only when you become a person and what that would mean. So I just used human for that. But I do think if you qualify for being a human, or in some people's view, being a person, that automatically should entitle you to a certain higher level of respect than the respect that one might or might not pay something that is human in the sense of having human characteristics or having been derived from a human. So those were the underlying ideas that I used, what I thought was sort of a clever grammatical twist to try to get at. But I may have been wrong.
Stephen, do you want to say?
Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, you make an interesting point in terms of consequences being more important than language, but I guess two answers to that. One is often the choice of terminology has consequences either because of the way that plays out in public communication or because of the categories objects or creatures are put in, or because of harms that hearing certain messages might do to communities. So language choices have consequences. And yes, I think sometimes there are some substantive sort of ontological conceptual questions that we need to at least have a go at tackling in order to get into the ethics, because otherwise, again, we don't know what categories objects are in. So while there clearly can be people who just sort of make up a terminology to advance their careers, I don't think that's the only reason why that activity gets done.
Yeah. And if I can, I would like to add to that two things. I think that already you heard it referred to in one of the talks today. There have been efforts, I think, through language to erase the ethical issue. And so, for example, if there's concern about using the human embryo for research up to or beyond 14 days, and we say, well, this isn't an embryo, this is an embryo model, or this is something else, it's an effort to do an end run around, and it's exactly your response that becomes important. It's to say, look, I don't care what you call it, this is what people are worried about, and they would be just as worried about it for this thing, which we know is an embryo, and this thing which you're trying to erase by saying it's an embryo model. And, you know, people don't remember this, but I'm old enough, and therefore, Smira must be old enough because it happened within the last 40 years. When IVF first started and people were starting to be concerned about the manipulation of the human embryo outside the body, there was a huge effort amongst the obstetrician gynecologists and the scientists working in that space to rename these things pre-embryos. And people would say, well, you know, what's a pre-embryo? And they would say, this is not an embryo, and therefore we can do whatever we want to this. And again, an effort to not attend to the moral values that people attach to these developing bundle of cells. And so it was an effort not to say, look, let's talk about what you care about. It was an effort to say, we don't have to listen to you because you're all confused. That's not an embryo, it's a pre-embryo. And for those who don't remember, they managed successfully to get it into some of the texts. And that becomes a problem because it's really trying to erase an ethical discourse that needs to happen.
Okay, we had a question in front of you, Nils-Erik, the person sitting there.
Great, thank you all very much for these presentations were really very exciting. Just two reflections and maybe to get your comments from them. The issue is about physicalism in the ethical space. So, you know, the beings that merit or, have moral standing that we respect, is it because of their biology? Or is it because we have, we generate ethical concepts? And so, Henry was saying, talking about humans and not persons becomes problematic because we run the risk of reducing everything down to just maybe a DNA. And I thought, Francois did well by actually making that distinction about gender, because gender is not just a question of biology, it's a bit more. And I think in ethics, especially in bioethics, it may be important not to fall into ethical physicalism so that we reduce our ethical issues to biological questions, because that becomes very difficult. But that's just an observation. And then the second thing is, in these conversations, and speaking at a National Council of Medical Ethics, the cross-cultural conversations are important. If you take sort of like Ubuntu philosophy, personhood or moral standing, if we don't want to use the word personhood, it comes from the relationships. It doesn't come from whether you were born in a tube or in a womb, or that's not what makes something morally worthy. And I think some of those ideas may help us to enrich our reflections around these things as they get more complex. Otherwise, we run the risk of sort of like using a poor set of ideas. Over.
Okay, who wants to start? I see you're on your way.
Sure. So first, I think am a personhood believer, but I didn't want to use that in this talk because I didn't want to get distracted into the big fights between the Peter Singer personhood folks and everyone else. But I think if we were, half of the episodes of the now ancient Star Trek Next Generation were about whether the android Data was a person or not. The idea of non-human persons is one that I think we should take quite seriously. And we may end up deciding that some of the cetaceans in the ocean, whales and dolphins and so on, really should be treated as persons. So I agree with you about that, but that wasn't what I wanted to do for this particular talk.
Anyone else? We have two sets of comments, one about physical ethics, as you called it, and one about cross-cultural issues.
Oh, I know. Yeah, sorry. The cross-cultural one. Yeah, I think the cross-cultural issues are really important, which is why I don't think there should be universal definitions applicable everywhere on all of these topics. On some of them, perhaps there should be, but not on all of them, where cultures are going to have very different views. But the reason I wanted to pick up on that, I mentioned John Evans, who's a sociologist of religion who has done wonderful work over 20 years actually finding out what real people think about these bioethics questions. He's got books on organoids and about genetic engineering and about a whole bunch of things. He has a book called What is a Human? And he was interviewing both experts and real people in focus groups and surveys and interviews, looking at sort of three main approaches: a theological approach, a human has a soul; a philosophical approach, which he viewed as mainly personhood; and a biological approach, which he viewed as mainly DNA. He discovered most of the real people, well, the plurality response among non-experts was a fourth one that the experts didn't even think about, and that was a social definition. A person, a human is someone you have a relationship with, which can be both bad in that humans who you don't have a relationship with, you maybe don't feel you need to treat with respect, and can be good in terms of extending respect to things that are important to you, like pets, for example, that aren't human. So it's What is a Human, 2016, John Evans, highly recommended.
Yeah, so the one thing I would add is I think it is really important to pay attention to relationships, and I think in a way that was what I was hinting at when I said the most important part about being a parent is not the genetic ties. And I worry two things about that. One is I think it reinforces a false genetic determinism, and it overvalues, reifies the gene. But I think more importantly, from my point of view, it begins indirectly to call into question what I would describe as a lot of progress that we've made in terms of understanding families come in all kinds of ways. And if we think about it cross-culturally, there are places where people are involved in other mothering. There are places where people gift biological children to other couples for all kinds of interesting reasons. We have blended families. We have all kinds of ways of thinking about adoption and different structures in different societies for making that happen. And for me, if you keep insisting that the only thing that makes you a real parent is to have a genetic tie, you're not only asserting something that's around that issue, you're also saying something else about all the other ways in which we do parenting. And so I think it's really important for us to think about relationships and how we build them, and that's what's important about parenting. And so I wonder about the ways in which we inadvertently undermine those things that we know to be true.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say something? and sorry if this is a bit of publicity, but talking about personhood and moral standing and other beings, I've just written a book. The title is What is a Person, actually? And the book was written between an American philosopher whom I'd never met in person. We wrote the book conversing online from, let's say, the American tradition and the African tradition. Can we agree on that? So in case people want to explore this question, and sorry if it's an act of publicity, but since we're talking about...
I think shameless self-promotion should always be allowed. And maybe encouraged, although I'll just note, it's interesting, you talk about a book on personhood that you wrote with a philosopher you never met in person. The words have many uses.
All right, so other questions from the audience or comments? Torbjörn, please.
Okay, perhaps I misunderstood you, but I was intrigued by your seeming complacency with regard to the demand of designer babies. Certainly, those examples you gave, cystic fibrosis and Huntington, the numbers aren't impressive there, but the Chinese example, for example, was very different. You wanted to avoid HIV in your kids and perhaps also enhance their cognitive capacities. At least there were rumors that it had these effects. So wouldn't it really be an explosion of demand for this, and perhaps also real need for this kind of techniques?
There will no doubt be an explosion of demand for all kinds of things, and I think what I'm trying to do is to actually get us to be attentive to things that are needs and things that are wants. Because I think as a society we ought to respond to needs, and we don't have the same kind of moral obligation to respond to wants. In this space, when we're talking about heritable human genome editing, I think it's really important to remember that there is no being who exists. There is no member of the community amongst us who is suffering. So it's actually a commitment to bring into being someone that you're then going to tinker with to hopefully have them not have a particular genetic trait. And you may make them worse off as they come into full personhood at some point. And so that's in part what I'm calling into question. Why would you pursue this as a goal instead of having a child and having a family in another way? So the first thing I'm trying to do there is to say that what has been offered up as the reason why we need to pursue this particular science of heritable human genome editing for reproduction, I'm arguing doesn't cut muster. It's just not a good enough reason to do that. In my book, I actually say, but you know what? I am actually prepared to be persuaded that there is a good reason. It just hasn't been advanced yet. And I give 2 science fiction scenarios where I say, I'd be willing to have those conversations. One of them is to say, you know what? We're wrecking this planet. Very soon, humans will not be able to survive on planet Earth because we won't be able to drink the water, we won't be able to breathe the air, et cetera, et cetera. And so we actually need heritable human genome editing so that we can genetically modify ourselves for survival. And then my next question becomes, well, if you think that's a worthwhile project, are we modifying ourselves to stay on this planet, to drink this polluted water, et cetera, or are we modifying ourselves to live in a spaceship? Because the design project has to change radically depending on what you think the environment is. But then you could come back to me and say, well, don't you believe in Darwin? Shouldn't we just phase out like all the other species? What's so important about us that we need to do all this kind of science? I mean, to me, those are interesting questions worth having, and I would be fascinated to have those questions, but then you're actually looking at a different goal or objective that has something to do with something other than what I would describe as an individual couple who says, I want this. I want a child with my genes that's healthy. And I'm saying there is no child that exists at this point. It's a desire, and we don't have an obligation to use up common resources. Remember, I didn't just say money. I said time and talent. There are only so many scientists in the world that could do this kind of work. If they're doing this work, they're not using their brains and their abilities to pursue other things that I think would promote the common good.
I want to push back on that a little bit. Let's say the Huntington's homozygous couple, where one is homozygous. Yeah, there aren't very many of those who would be healthy enough to want to have a child and be able to have a child, but there may be a few. And then a question is, when they say, do you have a good reason to deny me? I think the only real reason you've got is the resource allocation reason, because in order to let you do this, we have to spend efforts in this way when it could be better spent somewhere else. The problem I have with that argument is there's no guarantee that resources are going to be spent in any better way. Our societies spend resources in all sorts of dumb and foolish ways. And, a dollar not spent on this might be spent on biological warfare.
It could be spent on all kinds of things, but I think one of the things that's important is to understand that you're making a public statement about what's worth pursuing as a goal or objective, and I would lay my cards on the table and say, I'd rather invest in helping you to understand that that's not the goal that ought to be driving your life and that there are other goals and objectives that are worth pursuing. So we'd have a conversation about it, but I would not actually be supporting a policy decision that would say we would direct resources in this way, because then we're saying that that's an important thing to pursue. And I think you need to remember, this is not science that they can pay for, because it's science built on science on science on science. So it's not like it's a $20,000 or a $30,000 project. It's a hundreds of millions of dollar project that they're not paying for.
But of course, it's true of all the science at the frontier.
Yes.
No one is paying for the entire first round of the Human Genome Project at this point when they get gene therapy to cure their cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, and I'm all for curing people with illnesses. I don't know that we need to invest it in terms of creating beings that don't exist. I think that's a really critical thing that I want people to understand. I am all for responding to people who have needs. I don't know that we need to create beings who may have needs.
Okay, one more quick question with a quick answer, please.
Okay, so Lila Sally, I'm a member of the Swedish board. Thank you. I'm listening to you and feeling a bit curious, but also very worried about the future. So I'm very happy that you bring in this perspective on personhood, Caesar. And what also goes in line with what you presented is the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, which goes in line with Ubuntu, oneself as another, that we become a person, well, in relation to everyone that is in our surroundings. In Gothenburg, where I come from, we work with person-centered care, and which basically says that to bring out the capacity and capability in persons, you have to look at the patient as a person. Who are they? And you also have to create this surrounding which is secure for them, for their capabilities to, be visible to them and to the healthcare provider. So thank you very much for your perspectives, and thank you for making us grasp a bit for what is basically important, that we become a person in the surroundings that we are in. Thank you so much for your debate.
Okay, so that was not so much a question, it was a comment, and thank you very much to the speakers. They deserve a big round of applause.